The North Sea has always been a place of shifting horizons, an expanse where sky and water merge into a single gray wall. But in the early months of 1940, as Europe reeled from Germany's sweeping advance, that gray wall became the backdrop to a series of RAF disappearances that would puzzle commanders for decades. One of the first occurred on a cold morning in March, when a Bristol Blenheim from No. 59 Squadron lifted off from RAF Bodney for what should have been a routine reconnaissance patrol. What happened next would leave experienced airmen uneasy and investigators grasping for answers. The struggle began long before the aircraft vanished. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was among the harshest Britain had seen in years, with unpredictable winds and sheets of freezing fog drifting over the North Sea. Reconnaissance crews faced these conditions with aircraft pushed to their limits, Blenheims loaded with cameras, radios, and fuel tanks that left little margin for mechanical error. The men knew it too. The sea doesn't give a second chance, one navigator from the squadron wrote in his diary just weeks before the disappearance. If she takes you, she keeps you. The missing Blenheim departed at 6:32 hours, tasked with locating reported German naval activity near the Heligoland Bight. The crew, led by Flight Lieutenant Arthur Kingsley, was experienced but not immune to the growing strain of non-stop patrols. Radio logs show Kingsley's first check-in at 7:11, reporting minor turbulence and visibility dropping quicker than forecast. This wasn't unusual. The North Sea had a reputation for building weather faster than forecasters could chart it. But the ground team noted something else, small distortions in the transmission's tone, as though interference was pressing in from an unknown source. As the aircraft pressed deeper toward the German coast, cloud cover thickened. Kingsley's final message came at 7:34, entering heavy cloud. Adjusting altitude. After that, silence. Not even a static echo remained on the channel, an abrupt drop that radio operators later described as cleaner than any storm fade-out. No distress call. No sighting reports. No oil slicks or floating wreckage. To understand how unusual this was, it's important to look at RAF reconnaissance protocols at the time. By 1940, the Air Ministry had refined a strict grid-based navigation system to minimize risks, particularly over open water. Crews logged position reports every 15 minutes, and in poor weather even more frequently. Losing contact for minutes was expected. Losing it entirely was not. When Kingsley's aircraft failed to return by midday, Coastal Command initiated standard search patterns. Dozens of aircraft, from Hudsons to Ansons, flew overlapping routes for 2 days. They covered more than 5,000 square miles of sea. They found nothing. One internal report suggested that a combination of icing and disorientation in cloud could have forced the aircraft into the water before the crew could react. Another raised the possibility of interception by German fighters, though Luftwaffe logs released after the war contain no record of engagements in that region at the time. A third theory pointed to navigational drift. A slight miscalculation in crosswinds could push an aircraft miles off course, into waters where rescue operations were less effective. Yet none of these explanations fully satisfied investigators. Not when radio silence was so instantaneous, and not when other aircraft flying nearby reported only moderate turbulence. Among the squadron's personnel, unofficial theories circulated quietly. Some speculated that German radar jamming, still poorly understood by the British in early 1940, might have interfered with the Blenheim's navigation and radio systems. Others whispered about the possibility of structural failure in the aircraft's airframe, already strained by constant patrol sorties. But without debris, every idea remained speculation, filed away in classified folders that saw little daylight for the rest of the war. Looking back, the case offers a sobering lesson in the limits of early war technology. Crews operated at the edge of aircraft capability, often with incomplete weather data and rapidly evolving enemy tactics. Kingsley's disappearance underscores how thin that margin of safety truly was. Even with disciplined procedure and experienced airmen, the North Sea could swallow an aircraft whole, leaving families, squadron mates, and commanders with nothing but questions. And yet, it wasn't just the loss itself that unsettled RAF leadership. It was the pattern that began to emerge. Kingsley's flight was only the first of several patrol aircraft that vanished under similar circumstances in the same region in the months that followed. Each incident added another layer to an already troubling picture, one that hinted at deeper operational vulnerabilities during the opening phase of World War II. As spring turned to summer, commanders began examining these disappearances not as isolated accidents but as part of a growing mystery. Something in the North Sea, whether environmental, mechanical, or tactical, was disrupting RAF flights in ways they could not fully explain. and the next disappearance, still months away, would only deepen the uncertainty that hung over the squadron. Night fell early in the winter of 1941, casting a deep blue shadow across the runways of RAF Marham as crews from Bomber Command prepared for another hazardous raid over occupied Europe. At this point in the war, Britain was still fighting largely alone, relying on nightly bombing missions to disrupt German industry and morale. Among the aircraft scheduled for the operation was a Vickers Wellington from No. 115 Squadron, call sign Kilo Black. It would take off into familiar darkness, cross the hostile coastline, drop its payload over Bremen, and never return. Its disappearance remains one of Bomber Command's most enduring mysteries. The struggle of Bomber Command at this time was immense. Aircraft were routinely pushed to their operational limits, flying through flak storms, engine strain, and unpredictable weather. Crews worked under relentless pressure, often completing multiple missions in a week, each one carrying the knowledge that 1 in 10 aircraft might not return. It was like walking into the sea at night, one gunner wrote in a letter to his sister. You trusted the men around you, but the darkness had a way of swallowing things before you even knew they were gone. On the night of January 4, 1941, the Wellington's crew, 5 men in their 20s, embarked on what should have been a straightforward sortie, following a route that had been flown many times before. The flight to Bremen progressed as expected, with Kilo Black dropping its bombs shortly after 2 o'clock hours. They reported heavy anti-aircraft fire around the target area but confirmed no serious damage to their aircraft. The crew's calm tone stood out in the radio logs. They were experienced, confident, and aware of the dangers but accustomed to navigating them. As the bomber turned west for the return leg, other crews traced starlight flickering through broken cloud. The weather briefing had predicted moderate cloud cover but nothing that suggested major disruption. Yet within 20 minutes, multiple aircraft reported unexpected cloud buildup, drifting in from the North Sea. At 2:47, Kilo Black sent what would become its final transmission, entering dense cloud. Unable to get visual. Adjusting heading. The message contained nothing alarming. Bomber Command aircraft regularly slipped into cloud layers as they navigated back to England. But what followed was unsettling. A radio operator at RAF Coltishall attempted to issue course corrections, only to receive faint static in reply. A second operator tried to raise the crew minutes later, but the channel remained empty. There was no mayday call, no burst of panic, no indication of an attack, just a slow, steady fade into silence. For investigators, the key question was simple. How does an aircraft vanish so completely on a return route flown by dozens of bombers that same night? The first theory considered was navigational error. The heavy cloud could have disrupted the crew's ability to take celestial fixes, forcing them to rely on dead reckoning. If their heading was even slightly off, they might have drifted south toward the Dutch coast, where German flak batteries awaited. However, post-war Luftwaffe records contain no mention of a downed Wellington in that time frame, nor did any batteries report debris washing ashore. Another possibility was structural damage sustained over Bremen that went unnoticed until too late. Wellingtons were known for their geodesic airframes, remarkably resilient but occasionally susceptible to hidden stress fractures from flak near misses. A catastrophic failure inside dense cloud could have brought the aircraft down quickly, giving the crew no opportunity to broadcast a distress call. Yet, once again, no wreckage was ever recovered along the expected drift lines. A third theory, considered quietly by RAF analysts, revolved around the night's unusual meteorology. Several crews reported turbulence inside the cloud bank strong enough to force sudden altitude corrections. If Kilo Black entered an area of violent updrafts or downdrafts, it might have broken formation and descended into the sea without any witness. But meteorological archives show nothing to indicate a storm cell significant enough to cause such extreme conditions. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence came from a crew aboard another Wellington, flying roughly 15 miles north of Kilo Black's last known position. They described the cloud as solid, rolling, and luminous from within, a rare atmospheric effect caused by moonlight filtering through ice crystals. Some historians believe this luminous cloud layer may have disoriented Kilo Black's crew, creating the illusion of level flight while the aircraft was banking or descending. Without a visual horizon, even experienced pilots could lose situational awareness in seconds. Modern investigations into Bomber Command losses often emphasize how thin the margin of survival was during these missions. Navigation aids were primitive, weather data incomplete, and enemy defenses unpredictable. Kilo Black's disappearance serves as a reminder of how many RAF crews were lost not through dramatic aerial battles, but quietly caught between cloud, darkness, and the unforgiving waters below. What unsettled the Air Ministry most was not just the loss of one aircraft, but the familiar pattern emerging across theaters. Routine flights slipping into cloud and never coming out again. The next case, 1 year later, would occur far from the German coast, in the remote waters of the Bay of Biscay, yet it would echo the same haunting silence. The Bay of Biscay, stretching along the western coasts of France and Spain, was one of the most dangerous maritime corridors of the Second World War, a battleground of convoys, U-boats, and the RAF's relentless coastal command patrols. By 1942, as the Battle of the Atlantic intensified, aircraft sent into this region faced shifting weather systems, unpredictable visibility, and the constant threat of German interception. Yet the disappearance of a Bristol Beaufighter from No. 248 Squadron stood apart from the ordinary risks of the job. What began as a standard escort mission in June of that year ended without a trace, leaving questions that neither wartime commanders nor post-war researchers have fully resolved. The crew of the missing Beaufighter, Pilot Officer Linton Ward and Flight Sergeant Harold Baxter, were seasoned airmen accustomed to the hazards of maritime operations. The twin-engine Beaufighter, armed with 20mm Hispano cannons and rockets, was one of Coastal Command's most formidable tools against U-boats. "The Biscay feels alive," Baxter once wrote in a letter home. "Cloud, sea, and enemy all moving, all hunting. You fly with one hand on the throttle and one eye over your shoulder." It was a sentiment understood by every airman in the squadron. On the morning of June 14, 1942, Ward and Baxter took off from RAF Chivener as part of an escort formation protecting convoy HG-84, an assembly of merchant vessels sailing from Lisbon to Liverpool. Intelligence suggested that U-boat Grup Endres was attempting to intercept the convoy, prompting the RAF to saturate the area with long-range patrols. The weather was typical for summer in the Biscay: broken low cloud, moderate winds, and intermittent haze rolling in from the Atlantic. Nothing that would trouble an experienced crew. The Beaufighter's early radio logs reveal normal operations. The aircraft checked in at 9:42 hours, reporting visual contact with the convoy and tracking what appeared to be a distant oil plume, possibly the wake of a submerged U-boat. Coastal Command encouraged crews to investigate such sightings cautiously. False alarms were frequent, but so were deadly encounters with German submarines equipped with flak guns. At 10:03, Ward reported shadowing suspect wake, altitude 300 feet. This was standard practice for a U-boat investigation, descending low to spot a periscope, but still staying high enough to evade sudden surface fire. Another escort plane, a Lockheed Hudson, observed the Beaufighter breaking off slightly to the southwest, moving toward a bank of fog drifting across the water. The Hudson's crew noted nothing unusual, just another routine tracking maneuver in a region where weather changed by the minute. Then came the moment that puzzled investigators. At 10:11, Ward transmitted a short message: visibility dropping. Adjusting course. It was calm, professional, and free of any hint of distress. The operator at Chivener attempted to reply, but static overwhelmed the channel. A second attempt met with silence. Moments later, the Hudson lost visual contact with the Beaufighter as it slipped into the rolling fog. The aircraft was never seen again. The initial assumption was combat loss. U-boats frequently traveled in wolf packs and were known to lure aircraft close before opening fire. But the German Naval Archive, including the post-war U-boat logs, contains no record of an engagement in that area on June 14. No boat reported sighting or firing on an RAF aircraft. This omission is significant. German commanders were required to log such events meticulously. Mechanical failure was the next hypothesis. Beaufighters, though powerful, were notorious for uneven engine performance, especially in humid air that could affect the carburetors. A dual-engine failure at low altitude could have forced the aircraft into the sea almost instantly. But this still left a question. Why no distress call, not even a fragment of one? Some pointed to the rapid transformation of Biscay weather. Fog banks in this region could thicken dramatically within minutes, creating a white void where horizon and water merged. A pilot descending through such cloud could misjudge altitude fatally. Wartime meteorologists noted that the fog on that day developed unusually fast, faster in fact, than the Hudson crew realized as they watched the Beaufighter disappear. A lesser-known theory emerged years later during examination of radar logs. Although primitive, the early ASV Mark II radar used by some aircraft in the area showed a brief anomaly, a blip that vanished after only a few seconds, near the time of the Beaufighter's last contact. Investigators couldn't determine whether this was the missing aircraft, a weather reflection, or simply a technical glitch. But the timing remained notable. To this day, no wreckage has been recovered from the Biscay, an area whose depth and turbulent seabed preserve very little. The loss of Ward and Baxter is recorded in the squadron's logbook with chilling brevity: failed to return, presumed lost at sea. Yet the unexplained silence, the absence of enemy claims, and the sudden weather shift leave the door open to lingering questions. Modern analysts emphasize the perilous nature of low-altitude maritime patrols. Even slight navigational drift could put an aircraft dozens of miles off course, beyond search patterns. The Biscay's fog, with its deceptive layers and pocket downdrafts, remains a formidable danger even today. The disappearance of the Beaufighter echoed disturbingly familiar themes: good weather turning abruptly, routine contact fading into static, and experienced crews swallowed by cloud and sea without warning. And it was not the last time the RAF would face such a vanishing. The following year, well away from the front lines, an RAF training flight over the quiet English coastline would vanish just as completely, prompting investigators to question whether these incidents were truly isolated, or pieces of a larger pattern they had yet to understand. By 1943, the RAF's operational tempo had reached a fever pitch, yet not all of its mysteries occurred over enemy territory or distant seas. Some unfolded much closer to home, in the skies over the English coastline, regions considered safe, controlled, and fully understood by British Air Command. One such mystery began on a quiet August afternoon, when an Avro ensign assigned to RAF Cranwell lifted off on what should have been a straightforward training flight. The weather was calm. The route was familiar. The crew of 4 student airmen had logged dozens of hours in similar drills. And yet, within an hour of takeoff, the aircraft vanished without a trace, leaving behind a case that baffled both wartime investigators and modern aviation historians. Training flights, despite their routine nature, were vital to the RAF's wartime operations. Cranwell served as one of Britain's premier navigation schools, responsible for turning inexperienced recruits into skilled aircrew capable of surviving the complexities of modern aerial warfare. "Training is our lifeline," one instructor wrote in a 1943 memo. "A bomber crew is only as strong as its weakest navigator." With bomber losses escalating across Europe, the demand for trained navigators had never been higher, placing immense pressure on schools to maximize flying hours. On August 18, Flight LT William Carden oversaw the scheduled navigation exercise for Anson N4973. The crew consisted of 4 trainees, a pilot cadet, 2 navigators, and a radio operator. Their task was simple: depart Cranwell, fly east to the Lincolnshire coast, turn south to a designated waypoint near Skegness, then return inland. The entire route covered scarcely 90 miles, all of it over British territory and within range of multiple RAF stations. The Anson took off at 14:17 hours. Weather reports described light winds, clear skies, and excellent visibility, ideal conditions for training. The aircraft's first radio call came 7 minutes later, confirming altitude and heading. A second call, logged at 14:32, reported perfect visibility over the coast and no cloud to speak of. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Then, at 14:46, a passing aircraft, a Miles master trainer, reported sighting an Anson flying slightly north of the expected route, heading toward a thin line of cloud drifting in from the North Sea. The observation wasn't alarming. Minor course deviations were expected during navigation exercises. What caught the master pilot's eye was the cloud itself. A low, narrow bank, unusual for the day's conditions, described in his post-mission report as a single sheet hanging over the sea like smoke. Moments after the Anson entered this cloud, it was lost from view. When the Anson failed to report its next scheduled waypoint, Cranwell radio operators attempted contact. No reply. They tried again at 1500 hours. Silence. At 1514, the training flight was formally listed as overdue. By 1600 hours, search and rescue protocols were activated, deploying aircraft from Cranwell, Waddington, and Digby. They flew extensive search patterns along the coastline and inland. Nothing. The struggle to explain the disappearance began immediately. Wartime investigators examined multiple possibilities. The first theory was navigational error. Perhaps the crew miscalculated their turn and flew out to sea. But the Anson carried enough fuel for only a few hours, and no aircraft matching its description was reported by coastal observers or radar stations. Furthermore, the day's visibility was excellent. Drifting out to sea without realizing it seemed unlikely. Mechanical failure was considered next. The Anson, though reliable, was aging by 1943. Many airframes had accumulated thousands of training hours. A sudden engine loss or structural failure might have forced an emergency landing. But such an event would almost certainly have been visible to coastal watchers, and the flat farmlands of Lincolnshire left little room for a wreck to remain hidden. Yet no crash site was ever found, not during the war nor in the decades since. The cloud bank raised another line of inquiry. Meteorologists studying the day's conditions found no explanation for a solitary cloud forming in warm, stable air. Some suggested a sea mist pushing inland, common along the Lincolnshire coast, but this failed to explain the cloud's reported altitude and shape. The master pilot insisted that the cloud appeared out of place, lighter in color than typical sea fog and distinctly self-contained. One of the more perplexing aspects of the case was the lack of any distress call. The Anson's radio operator was trained to signal even the slightest emergency. The complete silence pointed either to an extremely rapid incident, or to a radio failure coinciding with a navigation problem, an improbable but not impossible combination. Investigators searched for evidence of jamming or interference, but none was found. Years later, when wartime documents were reviewed, one detail resurfaced. The master pilot had noted a brief glint inside the cloud shortly after the Anson entered it, as though sunlight had caught metal in motion. Investigators dismissed the comment at the time, suggesting it was simply reflection off the Anson's wings. Still, the remark stood out because no aircraft emerged from the cloud afterward. Modern analysts point to several contributing factors: limited training experience, potential instrument error, and the deceptive microclimates along the North Sea coast. But even with these explanations, the total absence of wreckage remains exceptional. The Lincolnshire coast, flat and heavily populated, rarely conceals anything for long. The mystery of the Cranwell Anson deepened the RAF's unease. This disappearance had occurred not over enemy waters or dangerous convoy routes, but in full daylight above friendly territory. It suggested that the same pattern seen in earlier cases, a flight entering cloud and never reappearing, could occur anywhere, under almost any conditions. And in 1944, as the Allies prepared for their final push into occupied Europe, another aircraft, this time from one of Bomber Command's most elite units, would vanish under even more perplexing circumstances. By late 1944, the Allied air campaign over Europe had evolved into a precise and punishing machine. Among its most vital components was the elite Pathfinder force, crews trained to mark targets ahead of the main bomber stream, relying on skill, speed, and flawless navigation to guide hundreds of aircraft to their objectives. These were the RAF's finest, flying some of the most advanced aircraft of the era. Yet even this elite cadre was not immune to the war's unsolved disappearances. In November of that year, a de Havilland Mosquito from the 8 Group's Pathfinder force vanished during a marking mission over the Rhine. Though conditions were manageable and enemy defenses were known, the aircraft slipped into an unexpected cloud bank and was never heard from again. The loss remains one of the Pathfinder's most puzzling wartime mysteries. To understand the weight of this disappearance, one must grasp the pressure under which Pathfinder crews operated. Their missions demanded precision, timing, altitude, and course had to be exact, sometimes to within seconds. A single misjudgment could send the bomber stream off course or into deadly flak zones. As one Pathfinder captain noted in a mission debrief, "We carried not just our own lives but the shadows of hundreds behind us." The Mosquito, with its lightweight wooden frame and exceptional speed, became the aircraft of choice for these operations. Quick, agile, and capable of flying above most flak concentrations, it gave navigators the edge they needed. On the evening of November 21, 1944, Mosquito KB-413, flown by Squadron Leader James Howell and Navigator Flight Lieutenant Oliver Grant, departed RAF Oakington at 1809 hours. Their task was to mark a railway junction near Koblenz, a key transit point for German reinforcements heading toward the collapsing front in the west. Intelligence suggested moderate flak around the area, but Luftwaffe fighter activity had decreased sharply due to fuel shortages. The primary concern that night, according to the weather briefing, was a patch of unstable cold air forming scattered cloud layers across the Rhine Valley. The crew checked in twice during their eastbound transit, each time reporting clear skies and stable radar readings. At 1912 hours, Howell transmitted a routine update: crossing into target zone. Clouds light patchy. At this stage, multiple Pathfinder aircraft were entering the same region, and their reports confirmed similar conditions. Yet only minutes later, Howell sent his final message: visibility lost. Entering heavy cloud. Marking run delayed. The tone was calm, but ground controllers noted something odd. The cloud he described hadn't been forecast in that sector. No other Pathfinder crews immediately reported similar conditions. The struggle to understand what happened next begins with the Mosquito itself. The aircraft was designed for high-altitude and high-speed operations, and while it handled well in cloud, it was not immune to icing or disorientation. However, the crew was experienced, skilled in blind flying techniques, and the aircraft carried a functioning H-2S radar set. If visibility failed, they had tools to adapt. But no further transmissions followed. Attempts to raise the aircraft at 1920, 1926, and 1933 all met with pure silence, not static, not clicking, just an empty channel. Other pathfinders in the area later recounted something unusual. A large, unbroken mass of cloud that seemed to materialize along the eastern edge of the target zone. One pilot described it as a wall, too dense, too sudden. Another recalled turbulence strong enough to push his Mosquito several hundred feet off intended altitude. Yet none reported seeing flak bursts, night fighters or searchlights, common threats in the Rhine corridor. Investigators initially suspected a flak hit that might have damaged the Mosquito's radio and sent it into uncontrolled descent. German anti-aircraft units in the Koblenz sector, however, provided no post-war record of firing on a Mosquito that night. A more subtle possibility was icing. Cloud over the Rhine Valley often held supercooled moisture capable of freezing on wings within seconds. If Howell's aircraft entered a pocket of such air, it might have lost lift rapidly. But Mosquitoes were equipped with de-icing boots, and icing severe enough to bring one down would normally be accompanied by distress calls or erratic radar behavior reported by nearby crews. None were recorded. Radar logs from RAF monitoring stations reveal another odd detail. At approximately 1916, technicians noted a brief flicker on their scopes, an echo rising sharply in altitude before vanishing. Some analysts believed it could be the Mosquito in a steep climb or dive, but the signal was too faint and too brief for positive identification. Others argued it was merely atmospheric clutter. As the war pressed on, the investigation gradually faded from immediate priority. The front was moving rapidly, the Rhine crossing imminent, and the disappearance of a single aircraft, even one from the Pathfinder force, was absorbed into the chaos of late war operations. It was officially filed as lost due to enemy action or weather, a phrase covering countless unresolved losses. Yet the unresolved nature of the case continued to trouble those familiar with Pathfinder procedures. These crews were trained to survive the worst conditions over the continent, equipped with advanced tools and unmatched discipline. The idea that a Mosquito could vanish in a cloud bank in the span of a few minutes, without witness or wreckage, seemed deeply at odds with Pathfinder performance. Modern researchers highlight several contributing factors: rapidly forming winter cloud, possible oxygen failure at altitude, and the Mosquito's vulnerability to undetected structural stress. But none fully account for the speed and totality of the disappearance. And like the earlier cases, one element remains consistent: a routine flight, a sudden cloud, and an abrupt, unexplainable silence. The RAF would soon compile these incidents into a broader internal study, an effort to identify patterns among the vanished. But even as they did, another question loomed: what tied these losses together across years, units, and missions? That question, and the RAF's attempt to answer it, leads us into the final chapter of this wartime enigma. As the war in Europe drew closer to its end, the RAF found itself facing a paradox. On the one hand, Allied forces were advancing on nearly every front, tightening the noose around a collapsing Germany. On the other, a series of wartime air losses spread across years, theaters, and unit types remained disturbingly unresolved. These were not typical combat losses. They were not the well-documented shootdowns recorded in Luftwaffe logs or the crashes witnessed by friendly ground forces. Instead, they shared a quieter, more perplexing pattern: experienced crews flying known routes, entering unexpected cloud, and never being seen again. As 1945 began, the Air Ministry undertook a rare internal survey of these disappearances, hoping to identify any thread that could be traced from North Sea patrols to Pathfinder missions over Germany. What emerged from this effort was both revealing and unsettling. The compilation began in January 1945, initiated by Group Captain Thomas Ellery of Operational Research Section 3, ORS 3. Ellery had long been concerned about flight losses that did not align with known enemy activity. His team collected mission logs, meteorological records, and survivor testimonies from dozens of squadrons. At first glance, these cases appeared unrelated: different aircraft, different years, different operational contexts. But once the timelines were laid side by side, a curious consistency emerged. "We identified anomalies," Ellery wrote in his early notes, "chiefly concerning rapid cloud formation, abrupt radio silence, and the complete absence of wreckage. This was not a conclusion he shared widely. In wartime, morale was as valuable as fuel. The struggle to interpret the findings reflected the broader challenge of wartime aviation. Technology had improved dramatically over the course of the conflict, yet it still lagged behind the demands placed upon aircrews. Navigation aids were limited. Early radar sets worked only under specific conditions. Meteorological forecasting was often more art than science. Even the best pilots could be thrown off course by strong crosswinds or lose altitude judgment in cloud. But Ellery's team noted something else. In several of the most puzzling disappearances, the aircraft had been in stable flight, with no indications of mechanical issues, and had shown no distress before communications suddenly ended. The ORS-3 analysts brought in meteorologists to examine the atmospheric data surrounding each incident. This is where the first major insight appeared. Rapid cloud formation, far faster than predicted, occurred in many of the disappearance zones. In the Bay of Biscay, in the Heligoland Bight, over the Lincolnshire coast, and above the Rhine Valley, weather balloons had recorded pockets of unstable air capable of producing isolated cloud formations within minutes. These microclimates, barely understood at the time, were especially dangerous at low altitude, where a pilot had little time to react. One meteorologist remarked, "A clear sky can betray a man. Sometimes the cloud forms around him before he knows it's there." That observation would later be cited in several training manuals, long after the war. But atmospheric explanation alone could not fully satisfy investigators, not when radio failures were just as sudden. The ORS-3 team reviewed radio logs from all 6 cases and identified another pattern. The final transmissions were not panicked or distorted. They were normal, methodical, often reporting a routine adjustment, altitude, heading, or visibility. Then, less than a minute later, all communication ceased. While jamming was a known German tactic, none of these incidents aligned with documented jamming operations, and some occurred far outside the range of enemy equipment. The reveal came when the analysts cross-referenced aircraft maintenance records. Several of the lost aircraft, especially the Anson and the Beaufighter, had recently undergone routine overhauls that involved the replacement or servicing of radio wiring. The records showed no errors, but it raised the possibility that communication failures might have been more common than reported, simply masked by the chaos of wartime operations. A brief electrical fault inside cloud, combined with momentary disorientation, could be fatal. It was not a definitive answer, but it offered a sobering possibility. Small mechanical inconsistencies, magnified by hostile environments, could erase an aircraft silently. Even so, the lack of debris remained the most troubling element. The North Sea and the Bay of Biscay were known graveyards for aircraft, but the Lincolnshire coast and the Rhine Valley were different matters entirely. These regions were extensively searched, both during and after the war. Yet not one confirmed fragment of the missing Anson or the Pathfinder Mosquito was ever found. Post-war RAF researchers began to view these disappearances through a broader lens, an acknowledgement that wartime aviation, despite its technological leaps, still carried profound uncertainties. A modern reflection on the ORS-3 findings highlights an important lesson. The limits of wartime knowledge were often starkly exposed in moments of silence. Weather could outpace forecasting. Radios could fail without warning. Navigation errors of mere seconds could place a crew in lethal danger. The human factors, fatigue, stress, and sensory overload were immense. In the end, the mysteries that troubled the RAF may have stemmed from a convergence of these pressures rather than a single cause. As the war ended, Ellery's report was quietly filed, its conclusions cautious but honest. These disappearances, though unexplained in detail, reflect the extreme vulnerability of flight operations within rapidly changing atmospheric conditions. Their mystery lies not in the extraordinary, but in the compounding of ordinary hazards. It was not the dramatic answer many hoped for, but it captured a truth at the heart of wartime aviation. Even today, the vanished flights sit in the archives as somber reminders of the unknowns faced by airmen who flew into cloud banks that changed faster than any instrument could track. Their stories endure not simply as puzzles, but as testimonies to the courage of those who navigated the shifting boundaries between sky, weather, and war. And in the final tally of WWII's vast air campaign, it is perhaps these quiet, unexplained losses that evoke the deepest sense of unresolved history.